Good morning, David.
Good morning, Salim.
David, what new concepts have been introduced into risk management?
Well, as you know, I've been doing risk management for a very long time. I think it's about 35 years, since the middle of the 1980s. And the reason I'm still interested and still engaged in risk management is because it's still developing as a discipline. And we're finding new application areas, new types of risk that need to be managed. We might think about cyber risk, which we've only just recently started to think about, social media risk, big data risk, national risk, some of these sort of social areas, new application areas. And certainly it's interesting to think about how our risk management disciplines and approaches can be applied in these areas.
In fact, you have said that the field is expanding.
Yes, I believe it's still expanding in its application. But the other thing which is still changing and developing is even in the concepts themselves. We've known about risk for thousands of years. We've had modern risk management since the 70s. And now I think there are still new ideas that are emerging, new ways to think about risk, and so new ways to act towards risk. And so this is what keeps me interested as a thought leader, is to get up in the morning and say, well, what's developing now, and what new types of risks are we facing, and how can we address them? So let's just talk about two or three of the new ideas in risk which have been introduced recently. The whole idea of people, the importance of people in risk and risk psychology has recently been recognized. Obviously, the psychologists and the social scientists have been thinking about this for a long time. But in terms of application and implementation into the real world of business and organizations, now to start thinking about the softer side of risk culture, risk appetite, risk attitude, risk perception, risk preferences, all of these things, we're suddenly realizing that they're important. But not just that, we're developing practical frameworks so that organizations can understand and express their risk appetite, or can know what a good risk culture looks like and develop it, or can become aware of individual and shared risk preferences and modify them. So the whole people side, I think, is new. A second area is something that we talked about under the heading of risk in projects, and that's the concept of overall risk exposure being something different from the individual risks at the working level. So in the project environment, we said there are individual risks listed in the risk register, but the question, how risky is the project, is a different question. It's at a different level. And overall project risk is not the same as the sum of the individual risks. And this idea has a wider application, not just in projects. How risky is my investment? How risky is my organization? How risky is this sector? How risky is our society? How risky is education of my children? How risky is parenting? There are so many application areas where we need to have a way of summarizing and combining the individual threats and opportunities to give us a view of the overall position to help us make decisions. So I think that is also quite new. And then I think perhaps the third area where things are new and developing, and again, which we'll talk about later, is about the integration of risk with other disciplines. Yes. So we're learning from other disciplines. Your area of interest in quantum physics obviously has a lot to do with handling uncertainty, Heisenberg's principle, for example. The area of environmental science, eco-science, and understanding how complex systems work when we look at things like the climate or the ocean environment, gives us new insights into the way that things interact. Learning from technical things like earned value, for example, and combining earned value with risk management, or value management with risk management. And I think in risk management we're beginning to realize that we don't just have our own set of techniques and disciplines. There are things that are useful to us from other disciplines that we can borrow and maybe adapt, which will help us to understand and analyze and manage risk better. So in terms of a new development, I think there's much more openness within the risk management discipline to borrowing and learning from other disciplines to help us improve the way that we do things in practice.
So these are new recently available concepts.
Yes.
Is there any concepts you believe that we should have them, but not yet people didn't think about these concepts from the point of view of existing problems? or risks. You see, sometimes, I'll give you an example.
Yes, please.
We have social media. It's a new thing.
Yes.
And there are a lot of risk associated with social media. So are there any concepts you believe that should be available at the moment in order to handle these risks in social media?
There's a difficulty with being called an expert. An expert is probably somebody who is 2 steps ahead of where you are. That's all. So if you don't know how to walk, somebody who can walk and run is an expert. If you don't know how to read, somebody who can read and speak is an expert. So with risk expertise, somebody who is 1 or 2 steps ahead seems to be an expert, or a thought leader, the idea that you are leading thinking in an area. All it means is that you're 1 or 2 steps ahead. And so there are some things that myself and some of my colleagues and other leading thinkers and practitioners in risk management are currently working on, which are not current practice, which are not common practice. To say that they will be the next important thing is hard to know. So the ideas, for example, of, you mentioned social media, of developing a shared consciousness of risk, so that you use some kind of online platform to share your perceptions, your views of uncertainty, your suggestions for how they might be dealt with, and through your social networks, people come up with proposed ideas about how that might be analysed and how that might be managed. And then you have behind that an artificial intelligence expert system which filters those things, which combines them together, and which offers you a route to a potential solution. That will be, because it comes from shared consciousness, it's much broader than saying, well, I will sit and think very hard about my situation and hope to produce a solution. It's more than just brainstorming in a group. It's much wider than that. It's using the available technology in a way which is not currently done. So that might be, for example, a way in which we can think about risk in a different way, risk as a social concept, as a shared experience, and using that shared, we might talk about the wisdom of crowds, which is a concept that's been around for 100 years, that a group of people together can think more widely and more correctly than an expert. And that might be something that's worth exploring a little further. Now, I know an oil company in Italy which is exploring the application of the wisdom of crowds and of social communities in terms of this idea of a social consciousness of risk amongst 200 projects across their entire portfolio. They're beginning to do this in practice. Whether it turns out to be the next big thing, we'll have to wait and see. But there are some interesting developments still to come.
Interesting. Thank you, David.
It's a pleasure, my pleasure.